Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer. Thanks to Trisaru for this one. This is a little bit of a new concept for me, and I actually think it's a really interesting one. If you like this video, be sure to let me know because I could definitely think of a bunch of other cards that could fit this premise really well. The question is, why is Animate Dead so darn weird? I mean, if you look at one of the printings that has its Oracle text, it's got this giant paragraph of rules of lawyerese on it, and that doesn't make a ton of sense because this card is from before when WotC thought every card needed 12 abilities and some exotic keywords or else people wouldn't buy them. So what does all this text on Animate Dead mean, and why did it have to be so complicated? Well, the short answer is that it's mainly historical. Animate Dead is counted among the oldest of Gs as part of the very first Magic set, and if you take a look at its original printed text, it's not nearly as gnarly as what we have today. Let's take a look at it, and we can pretty much tell what's supposed to be going on. You play the Animate Dead, it brings back a creature from the graveyard, but the reanimation process weakens it somewhat, and if they kill the Animate Dead, that kills the creature too. The issue comes from having to translate the flavor-driven, intuitive idea of a card like this into rigorous rules language that functions within the rules today. The first thing is that auras didn't exist back in Alpha. I mean, there were cards that ended up turning into what we would now call auras, but aura as an enchantment subtype did not exist yet. In those days, instead of auras and normal enchantments, you had local enchantments and global enchantments. Local enchantments did not have an enchant ability. They said what they would enchant right there on the type line. And this is the first issue for Animate Dead. While enchant dead creature makes it pretty obvious what's supposed to be going on, translating that into actual game terms is a little bit more complicated. See, you could say enchant creature card in a graveyard, and that would be a dead creature. The problem is that the enchant ability doesn't just describe what you have to target when you're casting the enchantment spell. It also dictates what the aura needs to be attached to on the battlefield. So once you bring the creature card back, it's not enchanting a creature card in the graveyard anymore. It's enchanting a creature permanent. So you would need an enchant ability that could handle both of those cases. You can see how, for example, Sugarcoat solved this problem. Hypothetically, you could play that on a food token. There's not really a reason to do that, but you could. The real reason that card says enchant creature or food is because they couldn't just say enchant creature. Once you put it on a creature, it'll stop being a creature and turn into a food. So the enchant ability needed to be worded in such a way that it would not fall off immediately after that happened. Unfortunately, they couldn't just use the same solution for Animate Dead. There's no problem with having the enchant ability be enchant creature or creature card in a graveyard. Sure, that's a little clunky to say, but it's not like it's worse than what we actually ended up with. The problem is that if Wizards went that route, the card would work differently from how it's supposed to. If it's legal to enchant a creature, it would be possible to cast Animate Dead on your opponent's creature on the battlefield just to give it -1/-0, which isn't something you're supposed to be able to do. And that's why they needed to start Animate Dead off with enchant creature card in a graveyard and then replace the enchant ability with a different one after it returns that creature card to play. They couldn't have the new enchant ability be just enchant creature either because of cards that can move an enchantment from one permanent onto a different one. Another thing that you might know if you're a longtime fan of the channel is that when an ability resolves, you perform its instructions in the order that they're written. Now this means that Animate Dead changes the enchant ability first and then returns the creature to the battlefield after that. Now this is actually an intentional choice. The card would not work if these happened the other way around. That's because if you have an instruction to attach an aura to a permanent that it cannot legally enchant, the aura doesn't move. And maybe you're thinking, well, that's perfect. That's exactly what we want. The aura is already attached to the creature card. Well, except it actually isn't. See, when a game object changes zones, it becomes a new object with no connection to its previous self. So what officially happens when you play Animate Dead is that you put the Animate Dead onto the battlefield attached to the creature card in your graveyard. Then its enchant ability changes from enchant creature card in a graveyard to enchant creature you brought back. Then the creature card in the graveyard moves to the battlefield. At this point, Animate Dead is not attached to anything because the creature card in the graveyard is a different permanent from the creature that's on the battlefield. So that's why the last step in the resolution of that ability is for you to attach Animate Dead to the creature, which is legal now because its enchant ability has changed. Now, you might have noticed that there was a brief moment in there where Animate Dead was attached to something that didn't match its enchant ability, and another moment where it wasn't attached to anything at all. Is that a problem? Well, actually, no. Obviously, those are both bad for auras, but you're not going to get burned if you put your hand in the flame for just a little bit as long as you pull it out right away. To put that a little bit more formally, an aura that's attached to an illegal object or attached to no object will get put into its owner's graveyard. But doing that is a state-based action, and state-based actions are not checked in the middle of an ability resolving. Once an ability starts resolving, the game doesn't perform state-based actions until after all steps of that ability's resolution are completed. Because Animate Dead was attached to a legal object before the ability started resolving, and afterwards, it doesn't matter that there was a brief moment in time where it wasn't. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense as to why that specific part of Animate Dead ended up the way that it did, but there's still one more loose end that I want to talk about. If you take a look at the first part of Animate Dead's triggered ability, you'll notice that it says, when this aura enters, if it's on the battlefield, do the effects. What's all that about? Why is it checking whether it's in play, and what would happen if it didn't do that check? Well, that's a great question. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while now, you might recall that there is a special rules name for when triggered abilities have this structure where a conditional if clause appears in between the trigger condition and the effects. It's called an intervening if clause, and triggered abilities that use this template are subject to a special rule. The reason Animate Dead is templated with this intervening if clause is because the rules team wanted to make it subject to this rule. If the intervening if clause is not true, when the ability tries to resolve, the ability will be removed from the stack and none of its effects will happen. So to see why they would want this, let's imagine what would happen if a player cast Animate Dead on a creature, then sacrificed or disenchanted the Animate Dead in response to the triggered ability that brought the creature back. Remember, this is possible because that's a triggered ability, which means that it will go on the stack and can therefore be responded to. If you did this, the Animate Dead would no longer be on the battlefield when its triggered ability resolved, but that's no problem for the game rules. Once an ability triggers, it exists independently from its source, and it will go on to resolve just fine. So let's see what that would entail. Animate Dead would change its enchant ability. Well, that can't happen because, like we said before, if a card changes zones, it becomes a new object with no connection to its previous self. So the Animate Dead that we want to change the characteristics of no longer exists. Okay, well, next we return the enchanted creature card to the battlefield under your control. Now, it actually is possible to perform this instruction, even though there isn't any creature card that's enchanted by Animate Dead at this time. If the game needs information about a specific object, such as what creature it's attached to, and that object isn't in the zone that it's supposed to be in, the game can access the last known information instead. So then we're going to attach the Animate Dead to that creature. Well, we're back to stuff that's no longer possible to do. And finally, the last thing that happens as Animate Dead's ability resolves, setting up a triggered ability in the game such that the creature gets sacrificed when Animate Dead leaves the battlefield. Too bad it already left the battlefield, so that's never going to happen. So yeah, the intervening if clause makes it so that if the Animate Dead leaves the battlefield before returning a creature, the creature stays in the graveyard rather than getting reanimated forever. Now, the last thing to talk about is why the thing that returns the creature to the battlefield is a triggered ability. If WotC wanted to, they could have made this a replacement effect that modifies how Animate Dead enters the battlefield. This way, there would be no way to respond in between when Animate Dead resolves and when the creature is actually on the battlefield with Animate Dead attached to it. And that's similar to how, for example, Deadpool works. I think if they were going to print this card today, they would probably want this as part of the package of stuff that it does. I'm pretty sure the reason for this being the way it is can be found in the 5th edition printing of Animate Dead. Generally, when Wizards was translating ye olde cards into modern templates, they based those templates on the most recently printed version of the card. Since the 5th ed one uses a triggered ability to return the creature, that's what we've got. Now, this doesn't explain why the thing that makes you sacrifice the enchanted creature also ended up being a triggered ability. The best guess I have for that is that it is a lot harder to word that in such a way that it isn't a trigger using current templating. And that about does it for Animate Dead. In summary, it's pretty weird because it was a flavor-driven design from Magic's early days, and it was difficult to translate into modern templating and keep all the interactions with it working the same. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.